Everyone working in the field of history probably has their one historical person or group, source, or record that is the bane of their present-day existence. Maybe it's the past curator with terrible handwriting. Maybe it's an oral historian that doesn't ask questions that you think are interesting. Maybe it's the census taker who doesn't walk in a straight line ever, making it impossible to track people down. For me, it's the Peabody family of Birmingham. For starters, there's way too many of them, and there's too many buildings that they owned. How are these two families related? Why is it the Ford Peabody Mansion, as in two last names, but there's also a dude named Ford Peabody? How many times did the restaurant burn down? Just how exactly is Ford related to Jim? But after 9 years here at the museum, I no longer fear the Peabodys. I have a genealogy and a timeline in front of me, and that makes me feel like I can take on anything. So, let's start close to the beginning of the Peabodys in Birmingham with Lyman Peabody. And maybe, if you're also confused about the many Peabodys in your buildings, this episode and the next will help you out as well. This is Birmingham Uncovered, a podcast by the Birmingham Museum, where we are exploring the diverse and compelling lives that built Birmingham, Michigan into the community that it is today. First, some background on Birmingham. We are a city of approximately 20,000 people over 4.73 square miles, approximately halfway between Detroit and Pontiac and Oakland County. This area was occupied by members of the Three Fires Confederacy of Indigenous People before white settlement in the area started in the 18-teens. Birmingham became a city in 1933, and today is known as a prosperous and multifaceted community with a thriving cultural scene. If you live in or work in Birmingham, or just hang out with Birminghamsters, you may have heard the Peabody name. Usually today, it's in connection with a restaurant that was in business until 2013. And it's a reasonable assumption that in a smaller city like Birmingham, that there was only one main family with the same last name, and thus all Peabodys are connected to the restaurant, right? Well, kinda, but also kinda not really. Our story starts with two brothers, Lyman and James Peabody. Lyman was born in about 1836 and James in 1839. And they were in the middle of the 7 sons that Sarah and John Peabody had. John was a farmer, and in the 1850 census, 14-year-old Lyman is listed as a laborer. While it seems weird to us today to ask the census taker to record the occupation of all males 14 years old and older, as we've covered previously, back in the agrarian economy of the mid-19th century, many children left school in their early teens to work. But this census also asked if anyone in the household had been to school in the last year. Lyman is listed as having attended, along with all of his brothers, barring 3-year-old Franklin. The Peabody family moved around from census to census, but stayed in the general area in between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie in New York. This area of New York was popping at this time, and the Peabodys lived within a day or two's drive from our previous podcast subjects, Emery Fish and Rhoda Bingham Daniels. Listen to their podcast episodes to learn more about the social and religious upheavals that were happening in that part of New York at this time. Following people through time using the census is better than nothing, but that leaves us with a lot of personal questions that we simply can't answer. Like, why did Lyman move to Pennsylvania in the 1860s? We don't know, but we do know that in Knoteville, Pennsylvania in 1865, Lyman and Sarah Foster married, and that their first child, Hattie, was born in the state as well. Knoteville is in the northwestern part of the state, along the coast of Lake Erie. And another thing, in 1861, James Peabody, Lyman's brother, enlists in New York to fight in the Civil War. Lyman doesn't. Why not? We don't know. But according to the author of the 1898 book, Birmingham, Its Past, present, and future, which had bios on prominent men in town. Lyman's first business venture was a store in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. But we do have a clue as to what brought him to the Midwest in the 1870s, and that was oil. When I say oil boom, you probably think Texas and not Ohio. And I know, I really thought that last episode was going to be the first and only time we mention Ohio this season. But sadly, it was just not to be. Just another way the Peabodys are messing with me, I guess. The first oil well in Ohio was drilled in 1859, and by 1883, Ohio ranked 5th among oil-producing states. And then, by 1896, oil production peaked at 24 million barrels, and Ohio became the top oil-producing state, only eclipsed by Oklahoma in 1902. This boom brought in speculators, drillers, and the perpetually hopeful to the geological area from Toledo, through Lima, and into eastern Indiana, along what geologists call the Bowling Green Fault Line, which fractured the Trenton Limestone Formation. Fun fact, the Bowling Green Fault is the only fault line around the Great Lakes. And, unlike some other fault lines, nobody seems worried enough about it to write any disaster movies where it triggers a world-ending earthquake or anything. So we got that going for it. Another fun fact, Lyman and I have the oil boom in common. I always laughed when somebody in my family mentioned that we were involved in the oil industry in Ohio, because I just thought it was a joke that they were all super committed to. Turns out, it was a real thing. So, this is awkward. Anybody got a Ouija board I can borrow so I can apologize to my grandma? The authors of Birmingham, Its Past, Present, and Future write that Lyman was there, quote, in the early days, end quote, of the oil boom, and did quite well. Going by the fact that he is on the map showing property owners in Birmingham in 1872, he was probably in Ohio anywhere between 1865, which is the end of the Civil War, and maybe into the early 1870s. Or perhaps he was in Ohio only a few short years, because his son, John Burt Peabody, who later on as an adult would go by Burt or J. Burt, was born in Michigan in 1867. So Lyman wasn't there for the peak of oil production, but was possibly there in time to get in very early on and make some good money that way. But by 1872, Lyman was on the map, literally, in Birmingham, and ran a successful dry goods store, which he ran for 35 years in the village. And what exactly did a dry goods store sell? Put a pin on that. I'm going to get there. And what exactly did Birmingham look like in 1872? The village had a population of about 700 people. John Allen Bigelow, he of train stealing fame, go listen to his episode if you haven't already, was the postmaster. And there were approximately 30 businesses in a busy village surrounded by productive farms. And this is foreshadowing for the next episode. Birmingham's Hill School had opened up a few years prior and employed 5 teachers. In the center of the village, right in the intersection of Maple and what is today Old Woodward, stood an obelisk honoring soldiers from Birmingham and the surrounding area who had died during the Civil War. Lyman wasn't the only dry goods game in town either. In the 1872 Gazetteer and Business Directory in Michigan, there are 5 other grocery and dry goods merchants listed in Birmingham. But what exactly is a dry goods store anyway? The dry in the name refers to things that were sold in dry instead of liquid measurements. A dry goods store carried ingredients like flour and sugar, as well as consumer goods like cloth, toiletries, utensils, and other goods tailored to the store's customers. Basically, anything that didn't spoil as it sat on the shelf. And it wasn't unusual for a village or town to have multiples of these stores. as one store couldn't possibly carry everything that a population needed, letting different merchants specialize and carve out their own niches. Maybe the guy down the street has the dry bean market covered, so you specialize in high-quality fabrics, and the guy that owns the shop by the river sells fishing poles. In addition to buying staples like flour and shotgun shells, at some dry goods stores you could do your banking, or have the merchants keep your money in their safe. You could pick up letters, or a recent city newspaper, and exchange gossip. A wise dry goods merchant, especially in a competitive town like Birmingham, knew when and to whom to give credit, what he or she should stock up on, what the newest fad was that was coming down the pike, and the power of relationships and word of mouth. Plus, Lyman's previous business successes left him in a good position to have the money to buy high-quality goods in bulk, saving him money in the long run, provided he picked the right high-quality goods to stock up on. As you may remember from our Levinson's episode, the 1870s were a time before department stores in Birmingham, and many of these dry goods stores were, to our modern eyes, quite small. In an undated photograph in our collection, which I'll put up on our website, we have a small group of people gathered in front of a storefront, maybe a few meters long. The building is brick, and maybe 1 or 2 stories high, and the front of the building has a covered wooden porch under a sign that reads, quote, L.B. Peabody and Son General Store, end quote. We'll get to the son of the and son bit later. I don't know if tea was what Lyman Peabody was known for before, but it was what he was known for in 1884. Tea has always been a popular drink in America. Heck, we started a revolution, in part, because we didn't want to pay a tax on it. It was a staple in dry goods and general stores of the time, no matter where you were. The Henry Ford, that big museum down the road in Dearborn, has an intact general store from Waterford in its museum collection, and it lists the price of certain goods sold in that store in the 1880s. Tea was, depending on the color and quality, sold from between 45 and 75 cents per pound. It's hard to make inflation calculations pre-1920s, but for comparison, in 1881, the average price in Michigan for a pound of coffee was 20 cents, and the average pay rate for a male teacher that same year was a little under $37 a month, with the average monthly pay for a female teacher almost $26. So, tea was a fairly affordable staple, and maybe, for those making less money, a nice luxury to have occasionally. The bulk of the tea coming into the United States in the 1700s and early 1800s came from China. American merchants had been trading with China since the end of the Revolutionary War, and most folks in Lyman's day were familiar with Chinese goods that were imported, like tea, ceramics, and the knockoffs that were produced in the United States, and fabrics like silks. But there was one Asian country that had, for generations, been closed off to the United States and the rest of the Western world that sparked curiosity among the citizens of Birmingham. And that country was Japan. In the 1630s, tiring of the constant flow of missionaries and bad trade deals, Japan closed itself off to foreigners. And everyone respected that decision. LOL. The United States letting any other country just do its own thing? Unlikely. In 1853, President Millard Fillmore, the president best known for looking like Alec Baldwin, sent Commodore Matthew Perry and some warships to force Japan to be our friend. This opened up several ports in the country for trade with the U.S. and for refueling both whaling and military ships. For the first time in generations, this opened up Japanese trade to those in the United States. Americans became enamored with Japanese culture and goods, and one of those goods was Japanese green tea. In 1860, 10% of the total U.S. tea imports came from Japan. That number jumps to 25% in 1870, and again to 47% in 1880. And here's where we get to the crux of the episode, and also to the point where I mentally spiraled for a few days. Have you ever lost something? Taken a can of beans out of a grocery bag, placed it on the counter, walked away to yell at your cat for eating plastic, walked back, and then not been able to find the can? And then you feel like you are slowly going insane in an episode of The Twilight Zone because you are looking everywhere and retracing your steps, and you still can't find it? And then a few days later, you discovered that your roommate, while trying to be helpful, placed it in the cupboard next to the breakfast cereal? I think every person can relate, and just about all the staff here. In 2019, I wrote a short article about how L.B. Peabody & Sons General Store imported some Japanese tea that set Birmingham aflutter. Since it was a very short article, I didn't mention my source. So when I was putting together this episode, being a responsible historian and all, I set about finding that source. And, of course, my notes from 2019 are either deeply buried or recycled. But I knew the year that this tea craze happened, so I thought that there was probably an article that year from the Birmingham Eccentric newspaper. The good news? The Eccentric is digitized. The bad news? It's not searchable. Did I read every single issue from 1888? Yes. Then I read every single issue from 1901, when Lyman retired. And spoilers, we'll get to that in a minute. Thinking that maybe the craze from 1888 would be mentioned. And then I read the issues around his death in 1911, and I didn't find it. Then I decided to retrace my steps as best I could from 2019. 6 years of work and research. Everything else I wrote had documented sources right there in the appropriate folders. So I looked harder, thinking that maybe I stumbled upon the Peabody info while I was researching for our exhibit in 2019, or adding to our Facebook calendar of events, and that's where I would find it. No dice. So I went back to the metaphorical grocery bag, the digital folder of general information on the two main branches of the Peabody family. And lo and behold, on day 3 of my mental spiral, I found the tea story source among information not related to Lyman and his dry goods store, but regarding Jim Peabody and Peabody's restaurant. Now, it's in its correct spot and correctly labeled, so I won't have to go on a wild goose chase again. But it illustrates really well about what I said at the top of the episode. Peabodys can get confusing, even to folks who work here. I'll also throw up the articles on our website too, on the podcast episodes page. So now all of us will know where they are and won't forget about them. So back to the actual tea incident itself. Japanese tea itself wasn't too uncommon in the area. There were several ads from the first half of 1888 in the Birmingham Eccentric from Whitehead and Mitchell's store advertising Japanese green tea. But Whitehead and Mitchell got their tea from wholesalers in Detroit, not directly from Japan. Instead, Lyman got his directly from the source, which meant he didn't just have the tea itself, but he had the original packaging and invoice as well, which were in Japanese characters. In our connected world, it's hard to think of an equivalent situation where a whole country and culture has been separated from the rest of the world for 300 years, where there are no living generations in the West remembering a time when goods and knowledge flowed back and forth, and then suddenly being able to see, feel, and experience the goods, culture, and knowledge from that country in your own two hands. It must have felt like a seismic shift. The closest modern-day equivalent in the United States might be North Korea's closed society. But it's really only been closed for a few decades, and we know the Korean language and a lot of the culture and the political landscape of that country. But Japan in 1880 was a completely unknown world, and Lyman Peabody had the door to it. and the residents of Birmingham rushed to the store to see the packaging and the invoice. It was a window to another place and a whole other group of people. And Americans were curious, and maybe a little bit obsessed. This was around the same time that many American cookbooks started incorporating Chinese recipes and cooking techniques, and when white Americans began seeking out ethnic restaurants for new tastes and experiences. Food often gets adopted into the dominant culture before the people that created that food do. So, where does one go after your store creates a cross-cultural sensation? For Lyman, it was time to start thinking about his family and setting up his children for success. In 1888, the same year he rocked the town with tea, Lyman announced that he was taking his 21-year-old son, Jaybert, into business with him. In 1893, a few years later, Jaybert married Alta Ford, the only daughter at that time of Frank Ford and his first wife, Elizabeth Stanley. Jaybert and Alta moved into the recently built Ford Mansion, which then became the Ford Peabody Mansion, which still stands today at the corner of Brown and Old Woodward. At the time, it was the stately home in Birmingham, and we'll talk more about it in another episode. Lyman and Sarah Peabody also had 3 daughters. Harriet, born in 1866, married into the McBride and later Perry families. Blanche was born in 1869 and married into the Hannah family. And Florence was born in 1875 and married into the Evans family. And like his fellow retail competitors, Whitehead and Mitchell, Lyman also held several civic posts in the village, as well as running his commercial enterprise. He served as both village and school board president for many years. After 35 years of business in Birmingham, Lyman retired in 1901 and sold his business and building to his son-in-law John Hanna for $3,000. When he died in July 1911, businesses in the city closed for a day out of respect. Lyman didn't seem to advertise too much in the Birmingham eccentric, possibly cognizant that it was owned by his competitors. Or, quite possibly, his long-standing relationship with his customer base and word of mouth was all the advertising he needed. From the clues we have, like his former business interests and being able to directly import a luxury good straight from its source, it seems like Lyman's Birmingham niche could have been upscale or more luxury goods than those sold by his contemporaries like Whitehead, Mitchell, and Bigelow. From the clues we have, and I don't have any direct sources from Lyman himself, his family, or reporting at the time, Lyman appears to have had a real knack for identifying business opportunities early on, jumping on them, and then getting out before the wave, be it a nation at war, an oil boom, or a tea craze, crashed. And it worked. Lyman sold his business and building for a really good amount of profit when he retired, and he held the respect of his community. And sometimes, even with all that, your grandnephew will find a way to outshine you. At the time of his death, Lyman and his kids, particularly Jaybert, were the best-known Peabodys in town. But that was soon to change. Next time, we'll pick up the thread of James Peabody, Lyman's brother, and see where the winds of commerce in 1870s Birmingham took him and the other Peabodys. We'll finally touch on Peabody's restaurant and sort out the 2 Peabody families once and for all. At least until the next time somebody comments on how the Peabodys could walk from their house, the Ford Peabody Mansion, to the restaurant. And I have to be the guy that's like, well, actually... I'm Caitlin Donnelly, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Birmingham Uncovered. To see photos and other documents relating to Lyman Peabody, his family, and his business, check out our website. The link is in the show notes. For questions, comments, and episode suggestions, please feel free to reach us at museum@bhamgov.org. Special thanks to the Birmingham Area Cable Board for PEG grant funding that made this podcast possible. Also, thanks to past and present staff of the Birmingham Museum and our amazing volunteers.